So we're going to do vocabulary learning strategies in science today, math in the future. So for some of you, if you attended the first one, there'll be a tiny bit of review at the beginning, but then it's going to be all new material after that. So basically what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about vocabulary and why it's so important. And then we're going to go into specific strategies that you can use in your classroom. There'll also be some resource type things as well. So when we think about reading comprehension, a lot of the strategies that we tell our students to use, that we teach our students, like predicting, inferring, connecting, summarizing, visualizing, questioning. So these are all reading comprehension strategies that we say, okay, you've got this passage, you need to understand it. Use one of these reading comprehension strategies. But here is, so I just want you to take a second and read this paragraph from a science text. Okay, so if you're a student or I said, oh, read this passage and then use one of those strategies to help you understand it. Predicting's probably not going to help you very much. There's no story there. You can't really predict where it's going to go. It would be difficult to summarize if you don't really have any idea what it's talking about. So this is where science passages can be very different than other disciplines, because if you think about what helped you the most, what do you think helped you the most when you were trying to read this? What knowledge base in your head helped you the most, probably? You can type it in the chat. See if anybody's willing to. Visualizing might have helped. Visualizing. Austin saying vocabulary. Okay. Probably the biggest parts of this particular passage would be background knowledge and vocabulary. If you knew the vocabulary, there's a good chance that you could get through it, right? I don't know exactly all of those, but I know what ecto and I know what derm means. I know what meso, I know what derm means. So I can use kind of my knowledge of prefixes, suffixes, and root words to get through this. And then the background knowledge that I have from the biology class I probably took a long time ago would help me get through it. So visualizing might help because you could visualize what you're seeing, but are you seeing my point where summarizing this is probably not going to be terribly helpful? You could put some questions in there, but it's probably not going to be terribly helpful if you don't have the background knowledge and the vocabulary. So that's where science texts can really be different than other types of texts. So I don't want to ignore background knowledge because it does play such a huge piece in the science discipline. But of course, that's not what we're here to talk about today. But I didn't want to just leave it there to tell you like, oh, here's the two biggest topics. Oh, but I'm not going to talk about one of them. No, I'm going to talk about one of them and then we'll go into vocabulary more specifically. But the biggest way for us to help our students gain that background knowledge. So if you knew a text like we just read together was coming up, you would want to start building their background knowledge to be able to tackle that text. One of the best ways to do that is what is called wide reading. And wide reading is just where students have daily interactions with texts. Of course, it'd be great if it was more than daily, chosen by you. And they would be at a level the student can understand. So this is not voluntary independent reading. This is not sustained silent reading that you see in K through 12. It's not that. It's you picking a passage or a current event or something connected to what they're learning about at their level, and then them interacting with that text every day in some way. And I'm going to try to show you an example. So this is Newsela. Hopefully we're all looking at the same thing, which is what are proteins passage. So you can go in and search your content. You also can add your students to this so they can log in and just read on the computer, or you can print it. So right now, this passage is written at a second grade level, and how you know that is you look down here. It says Bioscience News for Students and text level 2. And then you have the passage, of course. You also, if you click over here, you can put in writing prompts for the students to write. There's quizzes that are already developed from within the system. So you don't have to develop the quiz, but you can use their quiz or not. But what's cool about their system is over here, you have a little button that says 480L. That actually means 480 Lexile level, which is about second grade. But you can actually change the Lexile level. So max would be college and career ready. So that would be your students whose reading level are on par. And then you can change it. Let's say if you go to 820, it tells you down here, it's a text level of 5. So 5th grade-ish. What you notice is that the title pretty much doesn't change. The picture doesn't change. What changes is the words and the sentence structures in the body. So you could give your students different levels of reading, different reading levels in the classroom. And then they can all read about the same topic, but at different levels, and you're building their background knowledge. If you ever need or want to know the reading levels of kids in your class, just contact me. That's something we can very easily do within 20 minutes and get a good idea of what your students' independent reading levels might be. And that way you can match the reading to their independent reading level or their instructional reading level, whatever you're trying to accomplish. So News ELA does have a pay structure. So there is a point where the free material will dry up, I guess you could say. But readworks.org is completely free. So anything you find on here is completely free. I have a question from Matt Lynn, says, does News ELA provide definitions for what each level generally means? Do you mean what the Lexile level means, the like 480L, what that means? It will tell you generally like text level 5th grade here. 5th grade means that it's got vocabulary and sentence structures that would be typical of a 5th grade text. If you want to do the Lexile level, you can actually Lexile level charts have like the Lexile level on one side and the general equivalent grade level on the other side. Lexiles are a lot more sensitive than grade levels. So one of the benefits of using a Lexile level from the K through 12 perspective is that a student might move in Lexile level, but they might not, you might say, oh, they're at 3rd grade, but 3rd grade has many Lexile levels within it. So it's just a more sensitive measure, but you can also look up charts that give you that equivalence. But what changes if you were to print out, a 2nd grade level one and a 5th grade level one and put them next to each other, it's going to be the complexity of the vocabulary and the complexity of the sentence structure. And then somewhere and maybe it's behind the paywall for News ELA, they do have a whole vocabulary section. It used to be called Power Words or something to that effect. And if you have that part of News ELA, you actually can click the words like within the passage and it'll give you a definition and that whole thing. You also can print these. So you can print them, article only, article and quiz. You can present them big. So if you want to use them in your classroom, and if your student had access to sound, they could listen to it. I know we don't all have that option with our students. And then you can, like I said, you can add your class to this program or website, and they can actually log in and you can assign readings to them and they can do the readings online. So that's kind of just a nice feature. I haven't ever used it. I typically have just printed them out. Maybe that's kind of old school, but it's an option for sure. Okay, we're going to go back to, sure. Yes, so if you want to, find out what Lexile actually means and how it matches to a grade level, you can find those charts. They're really easy to find because they're just so common in K through 12. So if you're going to do this background knowledge thing, I feel pretty confident, not fully confident, that you'll find every topic that you're going to teach, but we've been pretty lucky with this, and we also didn't have the paid version of it. So it's the free version that we were able to pull from. All right. So as you may remember or not from the previous presentation, vocabulary is one of the sub-skills of the whole reading comprehension pie, right? So our students need to have all of these things in place to be able to comprehend what they're reading, which is, motivation, vocabulary, fluency, reading comprehension strategies, decoding, and word study. And we talked about before that the big piece that changes from when they're reading, learning to read, and they make that switch of reading to learn, is the phonological awareness and all of those decoding procedures become not as important anymore. So what becomes more important is this vocabulary word study idea, where they actually start to learn the words in depth. And we'll talk more about that in slides coming up. Also, one of the pieces that we don't talk about a lot is motivation. And I know that a lot of us feel like that's a big piece of what we see in our classrooms. But hopefully, we can talk about some ways to keep them motivated. So this is just the definition of vocabulary that we're going to use for when we talk about vocabulary here. It was to store a house of words and their meaning that students use to plan expressive language, understand receptive language, and to comprehend text. So that's our definition. That's the definition that I like to kind of think about, as it needs to become, the biggest part of it is that vocabulary has to become internalized. It has to become a part of their own language so that we see it show up in the classroom or in their writing. So we're just going to do a quick comparison. Why is science different than math, is different than history? So there was this concept for a long time, content area reading. It was a very popular thing to say, let's do content area reading. And content area reading was supposed to be when you could take one strategy and go across the content area. So using that one strategy to learn things in different disciplines. And for example, one of the strategies that we learned last month, I think it was pre-teaching. So that's a content area vocabulary strategy. But what has become more obvious throughout the years is that it's really also content area reading, which is great. But now we have what we're calling discipline-based reading. And the reason that's so different is because you have things like in math, you have a lot of symbols. You need to know what those symbols mean. So that's a little bit different than what you're going to see in history, which is our middle column, which you're going to be using a lot of context clues to figure out what words mean. There's a lot of metaphorical terminology that you have to know. And just the way that it's written, how it's written, who we pay attention to is very different between math, which pretty much ignores the author, that definitely wants to know, if the math within the paper is right. There are a lot of multiple meaning words. History, we really want to know who the author was, and we want to know what was going on around the author while they were writing. And then we get to science. So science vocabulary has a ton of Latin and Greek affixes and roots, which is unique to science. You also see that in math. There's the nominalization of verbs and adjectives. So you have verbs and adjectives that become nouns. So now we have to look at that, and teach our students that happens. There's also a lot of cause and effect in the way that science papers are written. So now we're thinking about, we have to teach our students to read like a scientist. So a lot of people that are on this call or on the Zoom meeting are scientists. You guys read in a very different way than I probably read as a social scientist. So we have to teach our students to read like whatever class that you're teaching or the student is taking. So that's where these unique vocabulary strategies come into play. This might look familiar to you, but just as a reminder, why does vocabulary change? When we go from reading narrative or stories to reading texts like from science, we can't just, the students can't just kind of know the word. they have to fully know the word. So they have to go from a to, oh, I've seen this term, I've heard it before, to I know this term and I can explain it. So the depth of what they have to know changes. We also get into these domain specific words when we talk about the tier words, tier 1 being everyday words, tier 2 being academic vocabulary that's in different content areas, and tier 3, which are domain specific. So we're getting into words that A, they're not going to see them very often or have them used around them very often. And B, they probably won't be using them very often. So they don't see them very often. They're not very common coming in kind of receptively. And they also are not used that much expressively, except for maybe when they're in your classroom or writing a paper for your classroom. So there's not like they're going to see the word probably on a billboard sometime later. It's going to be specific to that situation. So because they're low frequency words, they tend to be a bit harder to learn or know about. And then our last thing is that now common words like table, the furniture, now are table like a graph. So we not only have to teach them these domain specific words, which are very important and they have to know in order to read and understand their texts. Now we have to also work on some everyday words that have changed meaning. So that is why vocabulary is so important when we talk about content areas and why it switches when they're going from narrative reading to reading for your classroom or to prepare for class. So one of the biggest things is probably selecting vocabulary to teach, right? So how would you teach it or how would you select it as a teacher? You really have to be intentional. You have to think a lot about, the words. It's the words that you're going to choose. Most people would recommend 7 to 10 words, a week if you really want them to learn them in depth. I know that feels probably very slow. But if we really, that's why you have to be so intentional. If you're only going to have 7 to 10 words, then you really need to be intentional. The first thing you have to think about is it representative? So does this word that you're picking represent the concept that you want to teach? And if it does it actually represent any other concept that you're going to have to let students know, okay, I know in this context it means this, but I'm wanting you to learn this meaning for this purpose, for this topic. So we want to know if it's representing more than one concept. You also want to know if it's repeatable. So is this a word that's going to keep coming up? So therefore would be kind of a high priority word to teach. You also want to figure out, is it transportable? So are they going to be able to use it in multiple different ways? Are they going to be able to have a discussion, use the word, expressively use the word, writing and use the word? Are they going to see it in other classes, or is this an introductory class and they're going to have this pop up over next several courses? You also want to figure out, is this a word that could just be figured out through context clues? Because maybe you don't need to teach it. If it's a word that can be used or figured out through context clues when they're reading a passage, maybe you don't want to waste the time to actually teach it. Also, is it a word that they could break apart? So structural analysis, like I was telling you, I know what ecto and derm means. I can break that apart for myself and I know what it means, so I can keep going with it. I didn't need somebody to teach me that, although someone taught me that a long time ago in college, right? But is there words like that you don't really need to teach them directly? They could get through structural analysis. And then once you have your list, you want to think about cognitive load. Have you picked too many words? Have you picked too many words that might be around the same concept? Because we want to pick words that, do go together, but also, there might be a word or two that mean completely opposite. So thinking about how that's going to organize in the brain. So now that you have your vocabulary list, one thing that you can do is model word solving. So showing kids through what I call think aloud while you're in the classroom. So maybe you pull up one of these passages from News ELA and you model for them how you would read it. So you're reading through the passage and you might you're going to make it up. It's going to be a little bit of acting, but here's a word I don't know. So I'm reading along. Here's a word I don't know. And then go through problem solving for that word. Can I use context clues? Can I use word parts? Can I use a dictionary? So you want to go, dictionaries last, resources are always last, because we want them to see if they can use anything that they already have in their, their brains before we go to looking at another resource. But this is something that you can model for them. And what I do usually is, if I'm signing, then I might, kind of show them that I'm like looking up, I'm thinking, and I'll just let them watch the language that I'm using. And I'll give you an example. So this is an example of how you might do this. So let's say you had the sentence, the moon does not stay still. It travels around or orbits the earth. So that's the sentence. And as a teacher, you would say, I'm not really sure what orbit means. The author says, and you can see that whole paragraph. So I'm going to let you read the paragraph, and then we'll talk about how you use this. So this language is actually what you would say as the teacher in front of the class. The modeling of the word solving is within that language. Now, I don't think necessarily as a teacher that you have to script this out. This is something you can do off the cuff, but you do need to plan ahead and know that this is what I'm going to show them today. I'm going to pull out this sentence from their passage, or we're going to be reading along on this passage, and I'm going to stop and say, I don't know whatever the word is means, and then model for them. And then the next thing, the next step would be pick another word, stop, and then say, oh, what should I do first? And pull from the students. Can they remember that they need to look at the context clues first? Then they can look at word parts. And then maybe they want to look at a dictionary, and we need, as we need to make sure it's a dictionary that they can use as independently as possible and actually get a definition that works for them. So this is just an example that I'm hoping you can kind of put in your back pocket and use for later. Another activity that you can do is called Jigsaw Activity. You might be familiar with this, where you have each student is in two groups. They're in an expert group and a home group. In the expert group, you give them each, it says choose a vocabulary word. You could let them choose, or you can assign it. It's really either way, but anytime we can provide choice, it's a good motivator for students. So in the expert group, they all have the same word, and they are looking for the parts of speech. They're looking for the definition. They're going to draw a picture. They're going to write sentences. And you can do this in different ways. If you want to make something big that they can walk around and look at, or if you want to have them do it electronically, so you can, post it around the room, however you want to do it. So they learn within a group one word very deeply, and then they go back to their home group. Now in their home group, every person in that group has been in a different expert group. So when they come, they all have a different word to share. And then they share with each other teach each other the words. So this is a way that you can have them have a little bit more ownership over the vocabulary. And then you want them to do something with the words that they're learning in their home group. So this is just, I'm hoping this will open up. Nope. A graphic organizer, and I will, it's actually a really nice one from that Fisher and Frey made, and it looks adult. So I will attach it and make sure that it comes with the PowerPoint, but it has exactly what is here on the left, a definition, a picture, some sentences, and then they can take that page and put it in there if you have a vocabulary binder or whatever you're using for your class. And then we all know that one of the best forms of learning is teaching. So if they've learned they've learned their word in depth, then they can teach it to their peers. Another idea that you can do in your classroom is foster these partner discussions or group discussions but they're different in that you're going to tell them what terms to use. So turn to your partner and explain the advantages of nocturnal animals over diurnal animals. Be sure to use both terms in your discussion. So you're telling them exactly what words you're wanting them to express. So when we're thinking about vocabulary development, receptive is awesome, but expression is where we want to be, right? That's where we see them actually using the word and trying to use it correctly. And what you would want to do, of course, is be walking around monitoring and providing support for students if they're struggling to use the specific words. But as you can see, there's only 2 words here that you ask them to use. So it's not a huge cognitive load, but it is being very specific in what you're expecting and what you want the students to express. And then, of course, you can always have a share out after something like this. So everybody turns, they explain it to each other, and then you ask for them to share out as a group. Now, one of the things that you can do with sharing out is you can, we always think, oh, we just pick 1 or 2 students. So, Jamie, can you tell me what is an advantage of nocturnal animal? Awesome. Then what you can say is, awesome, Jamie. Crystal, you just saw what they said about a nocturnal animal. Can you tell me what you saw? Awesome. Okay. Over here, whoever's over here, can you tell me what you just saw that Crystal said and Jamie said, but say it in a different way? So now you've had 3 students be able to express the word and what it means, or what the advantages, in all off of 1 response. And one of the nice things about that strategy, if you do have a student that you notice maybe has a little bit of working memory stuff, or tends to struggle a little bit to answer questions in class because of, having to think on the spot or whatever. If you have the first students give you a definition, you have the second student restate that definition, you have a third student say it in a different way, that's a good opportunity to ask that student who tends to struggle to again say it again, because now they've had 3 models before they were asked to do something. And then you can go on to the next, diurnal. But it's a nice way to have more than 1 student get the opportunity to express the language. You also can do this concept of generating sentences, but it's not just writing a sentence, right? Remember, we want these kids to have a more in-depth understanding of the words that we're trying to get them to learn. So you would actually give a specific word, you would give a position for the word in the sentence, and then an expected length of the sentence. So the example here is place thrust faults in the 3rd and 4th position of a sentence of at least 8 words. So a little bit more complicated task than just making up a sentence, right? But we can see where, do they know what the word means enough to put it in a sentence and actually, be used correctly? And then you get more, lengthy sentences rather than a thrust fault is a word used in geography. Okay, well, that's not a very in-depth explanation of what that means. So this is actually making the students think a little bit harder about their sentences. And of course, with all of these, you're going to have to model them, show them how to do them. It's not something that you can just off the bat say, okay, do this, generate these sentences. That's just not how teaching works, right? So you'd have to model how you would figure out how to make these sentences, how to generate them. You would probably have the class work on some together, maybe some partner work before you let kids loose by themselves. One big thing that you can do, and I think is maybe easier in some sciences than other disciplines, is kind of making it personal. Have them have an experience with the words. The words are connected to something that they've done or that they're doing. So when you do a hands-on activity, you really want to emphasize the vocabulary, especially if you're running a lab or something and the words are involved in that lab. Make sure you're emphasizing them, bringing attention to them in some way, slowing down and signing them slower or bigger, or, okay, so this word's important, something that lets them know that this is an important word. Then make sure that that vocabulary is being used. So if you are writing a lab report, the vocabulary is going to show up in the lab report or the discussion about the lab. And then always connecting that vocabulary back to that activity. So, oh, okay, remember this word? Well, we saw it happening in this particular lab, and making that connection back and forth so that it's connected in their brains. I had another thought about this, but it has left me. Another thing, oh, that was my thought. Another thing that you could do is take pictures of them doing the lab and doing the thing, doing the activity, and then have them, you know, take those pictures and use the vocabulary words to caption them. So, you know, I could see in a lab report where you could include one picture per lab report and have them do a photo caption of the lab report and have the vocabulary word connected. Here's another one that I really think this is really cool, and I would really like to try this in a study at some point whenever I get some time. But this is called a possible sentences strategy. And I've presented this to several different groups, and I get a lot of resistance on this strategy. Oh, our kids are not going to be able to do this. Well, I think if you teach them how, they could. So A, you're going to have to teach them, and it's probably not going to be your best fun day in the world. And B, if we don't believe they can do it, then who is going to? Yes, this is a complex strategy, but just imagine the richness of this strategy once you've taught them how to do it. So what you do is you get a list of words. So I gave you a list of words there. You define all the words. So the students would go through and define them, you know, in their own words, not like a copy from the definition, a definition from the dictionary. And then you would want them to pair related words. So they'd go through and pair them. You probably can tell from the pairings whether or not they really understand what the word means. So that gives you a lot of a clue as to whether or not they're getting understanding what the words mean. Then you're going to have them write sentences with their word pairs, but not just any sentence. You're going to say, I want you to write a sentence with these word pairs that you think you might see in this science passage. So you've already got a reading that these words are connected to, and you're going to say, you know, what do you think the sentence could be in this passage? So they have their sentence that they're making, and then the passage that you've chosen for them. Now they're going to actually read the passage, and they're going to find the words. They're going to pull out the sentences and compare their sentence that they wrote to what they saw in the text. So this is really, really, really high level processing of vocabulary, but it's really rich and deep processing. So they're actually going to have their sentence, they'll pull out the sentence from the passage, they'll compare. And if they feel like they want to fix their sentences based on what they read, they can. So they have that option. Now you're going to have to teach every step of this. You're going to have to model every step of this. But if you begin at the beginning of your class, teaching them how to do this, then by the end, they're going to be doing it, you know, probably with little support. It would be cool if you had 2 classes in succession and you could, you know, keep this going until it really internalizes as a strategy. So I have a comment that says, I'm looking at all of these great strategies and probably having the same reaction as others, how to fit this into curriculum. Would there be any sense to consider developing these strategies into a science vocabulary and strategies course? I'm not opposed to the idea. It really needs to be connected to something. So if you were teaching the concept of, I don't know, free body diagrams, I don't know, I'm just pulling something out of something that's hanging out in my brain. I don't want to just teach that kind of in a vacuum. I want it to be taught within the context of what's happening in the classroom. I don't think that these things are going to take as long to teach as you might be assuming. You could probably do this in 5 to 7 minutes a day or per class session. And then once they become more automatic, then you wouldn't be taking up as much time. This is going to be a lot more rich and more complicated than some of the traditional ways that we use to teach vocabulary, like copying definitions or like vocabulary workbooks. But those things are so disconnected from our curriculum that the students often don't see where they're supposed to be or where they're supposed to connect. And also, if you think about this particular strategy, they're not just going to be learning these words, right? They're actually going to be developing their background knowledge, looking at a passage. So there's more going on here than just rote memorization of words. So I'm not opposed to the idea of a science vocabulary course, but I feel like if they're not truly connected to something that they're learning, it's not really going to stick potentially. We also know that it's very, very common that we teach a strategy and our students aren't able to use that strategy in another context. So I think embedding these in science courses, and even if it's a department, if you decided, okay, here's 2 or 3 strategies that we want to all use. So you're all using 2 or 3 of the same strategies, and maybe you've labeled them, they know them, you have a tip sheet for them, that strategy keeps popping up. That's probably where you're going to get more bang for your buck, but that takes coordination amongst the department. Your kids, I'm sorry, every one of our kids should be reading every day in class and should have a little, vocabulary lesson every day in class. They should be. It's just what should be happening. So, and I understand that everybody has a lot of content to teach, but think about what you're getting out of this if you started doing it early and just kept going with it. Like, for example, if the first activity of every class was just to read a short passage that you picked for the day and start having a conversation off of that passage, and then launched into whatever you were teaching for the day, and vocabulary was tied to that. I know it requires a little bit of redesign. And if the department wanted to come up with strategies that they were going to highlight, that obviously incorporating it is another thing to think about. But I definitely think it'd be worth it for our students' benefit at the very least. Another thing that I think probably you probably in the science department are already doing this and pretty good at it. It's helping kids organize and do concept building. So I just have 2 different examples here where you have the gas, solid, liquid, and then the different states and how they change. You have those in a way that they can see the word, but they also, where the word is in the organizer, has a meaning. So it's helping them organize all those words that they're learning, and then how it has, and how they all connect with each other. The second one, the little squares are called Frayer models, F-R-A-Y-E-R. So that's a Frayer model. You can find those all over the internet. But what this person did is they have all the different Frayer models for the words that are within force and motion. So they're telling the students, here's all these words that you need to know, and they're within this one category. So helping our students organize and build concepts in their brain. What's so important about this is when a student goes to pull a word, so you're assigning the lecture and they see a vocabulary word and their brain goes to pull it forward, we need them to be pulling it from the right place. It needs to come from, if you think about their brain as a file cabinet, it needs to come from the right file or they will misunderstand. And then you've got a whole nother thing going on. So they think the word's meaning, they're watching you and maybe understanding what you're assigning, but the word meaning they're holding is maybe the wrong meaning for this class, or the wrong meaning completely, but it could be that it's just the wrong meaning for this particular context. Another thing that you can do is teach word parts. So everybody knows this is my big push. I'm always pushing teaching word parts, especially in science. We've done several studies at NTID that this does seem to be something kids learn, and they learn it easily. It doesn't take that much time. I think we taught it maybe 5 to 7 minutes a day. Awesome, yay, teaching some word parts currently, that's awesome. So you want to teach, the word part. So hydro means water, phobic meaning fear. So you teach them the word parts, what they mean. You have discussions about, okay, this is not going to be 100% right. I always say this is kind of an 80%. 80% of the time you're going to get something from this, and sometimes you're not, but it's a tool. So don't make them feel like this is going to answer everything. And then what you can do is teach word families. So you have hydrophobic, hydrophilic, and you just keep going from there. Hydro, hydro, hydro. They learn all the different words that could come from hydro. And this is just a way of most affixes or roots have about 10 other words that can come off of that one word. So you have to think that this is actually a way to kind of generate vocabulary learning when you're not teaching directly what each word means. So they can start to kind of learn words on their own while they're reading. Of course, the caveat is always that some of these meanings have transformed so much over time that they don't mean the exact same thing as they did when these words were initially established. That is true. However, if you look at hydrophobic, at least if I know while I'm reading this, phobic means fear, I've got something, right? It's a start. It's better than just looking at hydrophobic and knowing nothing about it at all. So it gives me a place to jump off from, starting point while I'm reading. And then you always can embed questions in text. So News ELA is back down there because that's a good place to get these passages. And I'll just show you what this looks like. If you had a passage, this is a passage from News ELA, but you can write little, questions like, what do you think this passage is about? And have them stop and write or stop and think, however you want to handle it. What is a fast radio burst? Hopefully you see these little blue things popping up. Eliminate means, so you can put in things into the passage to have them stop and either try to answer it or they need to look and answer it. This is just a different way to get at some vocabulary practice. And then I actually had time for questions. I think this might be the only time this has ever happened to me. Happy to answer questions, and that's my email address. And again, I'm very happy I'll send this PowerPoint to Hope, and I'll also send that graphic organizer page that was linked in here. And let me see what's going on here. So Sarah was saying, Sarah Sarche says, my students have root words journals where they add new vocabulary words each lecture. We add 2 to 3 per lecture. Before telling the root meaning, I ask where they've seen the root word and let them derive the meaning themselves. It sticks much better than if I just tell them the meaning. Yes, that, exactly. And it really doesn't take that much time. And if you get into the habit, you just can do it, right? The next thing is to talk about the Center for Education Research Partnerships. Okay, so the Center for Education Research Partnerships, our job is to support you as faculty. If you want to do, like, let's say Sarah says, I've done these root word journals, I really think they work. Can you come in and help me design a study and collect data on it? So that's what we do. We can collaborate with you as a faculty member and do an educational research project. So figuring out whether or not a teaching strategy that you're using is working, or figuring out if, or even if you just don't know yet, you are thinking, maybe you were like, oh, I want to look at collaborative strategic reading, but I'm not really sure how it would work in my classroom. You can come to us and that's what we'll do. We'll work out how it could be fit to your classroom. So the strategy, and then how can we measure outcomes off of it? Some examples is I've got some publications with some of your faculty members on lab settings, communication in lab settings. So I supported one of your faculty members, Austin and I published on that. Jason Nordhaus and I published on teaching word parts in astronomy and also using reading comprehension strategies in astronomy. And then right now I'm working with a couple of faculty in the Department of Liberal Studies looking at whether or not alumni mentoring helps with English development over a semester. So that's part of my job, is to support you guys if you have educational, and really it's educational, that's my teaching strategies type stuff. If you're doing something in your classroom and you want to measure it and publish it, that's where we can support you. Let me see. Oh, Sarah was saying that after the semester, later in the semester, she could put a larger unknown word in front of them. They can often decide its meaning by looking for the root, and they've learned the strategy of applying their prior knowledge to understanding new unknown words. And she said, no, yes, it doesn't take much class time. Exactly, and that's that particular strategy, doing the word parts, is probably like a big bang for your buck type activity. That's the reason why I kind of push it, because at least from the research that we know about hearing and deaf kids, morphological knowledge overtakes phonological knowledge in about 3rd or 4th grade. So them needing to know those word parts becomes more important than sound-based learning strategies for reading at 3rd and 4th grade. So once they get to us, clearly that's the piece that's more important, is those word parts. And I do have them somewhere. There's rules for combining the words in English, and you can teach those rules if you want to. It depends on how, you know, in depth you want to get. It might be something you could partner with somebody in DLS, or I'd be happy to sit down with you and go through and show you how to find, like once you find the word, how to, there's tons of dictionaries out there. There's tons of lists out there. However you would want to tackle it. Elizabeth and Austin are giving kudos to Sarah. They're going to borrow Sarah's idea. Yes, memory retention is a huge challenge. Like we said, these words are used infrequently and they're seen infrequently, and that makes it even more challenging than the challenge that we obviously have. So the way Sarah's doing it, where they're using it and they know how to apply the strategy by the end of the semester, that's the best way to get kind of that bang for your buck kind of instruction. And you can use different approaches to how you teach it or how you teach these things. And I'm not saying incorporate all of these strategies. You pick one and maybe pick one for one semester and see what you think. It's really kind of open to what you're comfortable with, but please reach out if you ever are thinking about something in your classroom and you think, oh, I would love to know if this is really working or not. We will totally support you. We will help you through the IRB process, data collection, the whole kit and caboodle, because it helps us learn too over in the center. You're welcome, Catherine. I probably didn't teach you anything new, Catherine. I feel like. You're all welcome. I hope you'll email me. Hope I will get this presentation to you and that graphic organizer. And if there's not any more questions, oh yeah, the next workshop, you guys really got doubled down on this because I did science and math and it's just your department, it seems like. So the next workshop is December 10th at 11. And we're going to do vocabulary development in math. Happy Monday, everyone.